Thank you for attending this webinar with us today on international methods of payment for exporting and importing. I'm your moderator, Jenny Alton from the New York Small Business Development Center Central Office. This webinar is brought to you by the International Trade Initiative of the NYSBDC. Here at the NYSBDC, we are a U.S. Small Business Administration resource partner with regional centers at higher education institutions and outreach offices at other locations across New York State. Our free advising, education, research, and advocacy services are made possible by funding from the SBA, New York State, and our host campuses. Your presenter today will be Syed Murtaza, Vice President of Global Trade Finance at Regions Bank. We also have with us Dr. Mercedes Sanchez-Moore, our own Director of International Trade, who will say a few words before Syed begins his presentation. So you know, we are recording today. We will share links to a PDF copy of the slides and the recording in a follow-up email. Attendees are muted and will not be on camera today. Your chats will be visible to me and our presenters. If you have any questions during the presentation, please don't hesitate to type them in the Q&A box as they come up. You can open Zoom's Q&A box from the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And if you don't currently see that button, click on the 3 dots for more, and you should be able to find it in that menu. We will address questions throughout the presentation. So with that, I will turn the time over to Mercedes.
Thank you, Jenny. There you go. For your kind introduction, and welcome everyone to our webinar on how to create international methods of payment used in exporting and importing. I am going to provide a brief introduction on the New York Small Business Development Center and our international trade program. The New York SBDC is a partnership of the U.S. Small Business Administration, SUNY, the City University of New York, New York State, higher education institutions, and the private sector. The SBDC provides one-to-one business advisement, training, and research in support of entrepreneurship and economic development for the state of New York. The International Trade Initiative is a special program within the New York SBDC network, which is housed and part of the SUNY network of 20 regional centers and 72 outreach and satellite offices. 98% of the population in the state of New York is within 30 minutes of an SBDC service location. The New York SBDC International Trade Initiative supports SBDC clients statewide with expertise and experience on international trade and trade compliance. We also provide SBDC staff with professional development, increasing trade advising capabilities statewide. All of our services are free, customized, and 100% confidential. We help small and medium-sized companies become globally competitive by providing export development and import operations assistance through one-on-one trade consulting, market research, innovative training, and links to additional export resources provided by our partners, Global New York, the U.S. Commercial Service of the Department of Commerce, the Small Business Administration, Exim Bank, and other public and private organizations, such as today's speaker, Regions Bank. The New York SBDC can help your business become a successful competitor in foreign markets by helping you plan and implement your export strategy. Our international business consultants are available to assist retailers, manufacturers, high technology, and even service companies with export planning and other areas such as export readiness review, export business plans, targeting international markets, selecting sales and distribution channels, legal considerations and licensing, logistic procedures and documentation, market research and trade statistics, and international financing options. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce our main speaker of today's webinar, Syed Murtaza. A native of Dubai, Syed Murtaza has spent the last 2 decades participating in the banking and finance arena, having completed his formal education in finance from Monmouth University in New Jersey. In his role, Syed serves commercial and corporate clients in the SME to mid-cap space, $10 million to $10 billion in annual sales. He's a frequent panelist and speaker in forums on trade finance and international banking. Syed combines his passion for international trade finance and the invaluable institutional knowledge of Regions Bank, 100+ years of global trade business to assist businesses. In his spare time, Syed travels extensively with his family and he loves hiking with his dog. Syed is, as Jenny said, Syed is currently Vice President of Global Trade Finance at Regions Bank, which is the only bank to receive the President's E-Award for Export Services in 2024. Regions has been a leading SBA export and Exim Bank lender in the United States. Please, Syed, go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you. Please let me know if you can see this.
We can.
Okay, great.
You want to put it in presentation mode though.
Yeah. All right, excellent. So thank you for joining today's webinar on international methods of payment. We're going to talk about why that matters in the international context, right? When you're buying and selling across borders, the method of payment becomes very, very critical, right? Because there's no cash register in front of you. You can't just hand over a good and get the payment right away. So how do you de-risk all of that? Where does the risk lie? How do you work with a bank? How do you use those methods of payment to kind of provide you an alternative financing source? Because very often you're looking to bridge that gap that, it takes 20, 30 days for your goods to be delivered. And so, all of those questions will be addressed here. And these are fundamental trade concepts, which, regardless of the size of the business, they are all they're applicable to whatever stage of business cycle, life cycle you are in, and they play a very critical role in terms of understanding potential risk factors, how do you mitigate them, and understanding how do you become, kind of proficient in leveraging those to maximize your transactions. So let's, we're going to cover the different methods of payment that are used. We're going to focus in on a couple of methods like export letters of credit and documented collections, and we're going to talk about how businesses use those in the best possible manner.
Syed, we're still not seeing the presentation view. We're seeing your PowerPoint, like in PowerPoint.
I hope that fixed it.
That did indeed. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about, here's an overview of the different methods of payment that exist out there. This is, if you look at it from left to right, you have, from the seller's perspective, you have the seller can get cash in advance from their customer. Or on the far extreme right, you will see open account. What does that mean? That means that the seller agrees, I'll ship you the goods, pay me in 30 days or 60 days or whatever. There's no control or hold back or any security there. You're just trusting the buyer to pay you as agreed, right? So, which may be very common in domestic business commerce, where if you're buying and selling from one state to the next, you can do that, especially if you have had a couple of transactions, you have built some history with them, and it does not impact your business that much from a financing perspective, because you can afford to wait 30 60 days, right, if needed. So it makes so each of these, the point being, each of these cases, types of payment agreements make sense depending on what's going on, but we're going to examine the most common ones and the pitfalls and uses of them. So in between, from cash in advance, if you look at the green section, from cash in advance, where the seller gets the payment in advance, if you think about it, the seller is in the most preferred position possible. They have no risk. They have the money in hand. They can ship the goods and know that they've already been paid, right? The buyer, on the other hand, is extremely exposed. They've handed over cash or payment for those goods, and they're hoping and praying that they'll get what they paid for, and when they need it, right? So timing is crucial as well because they might need the goods for a project. So on the you move a little bit. What bridges this gap, right? Where on one extreme end the seller is completely protected, on the other one the buyer is protected because they've received the goods on open account first and then they'll pay later. So what bridges that gap, that risk bridge, is letters of credit and documentary collections. These are not new solutions or banking products. They've been around for over 180 years or so. And what they do is they allow buyers and sellers, especially across borders and across, halfway across the globe or whatever the case may be, to kind of use banks as proxies to trust each other or to control, have some belts and suspenders built into the transaction where they can pull back and have some control over when and how they get paid or when and how they receive the goods. So moving on from here, we're going to take a deep dive into the export letters of credit first, and then we'll cover the collections piece. So what is a letter of credit? A letter of credit is literally a letter on a bank letterhead, in which the bank is promising to pay someone if they ship the goods X, Y, and Z. It's by a certain date, and it's signed. If you look at a hard copy or an electronic copy, is authenticated. So what does that mean? Why does it matter? Well, with a letter of credit, the bank is promising to pay someone, right? The seller. So now the seller doesn't have to rely on the buyer's word or rely on, some other, third party. They know that the bank that issued the letter of credit is on the hook to pay them, as long as they ship and comply with what the letter of credit states. You got to ship X amount of containers by this date to this port, whatever the case might be. So essentially, this came about because a bank is hypothetically and typically, customarily, a better risk profile and is typically publicly traded and well known than some unknown buyer or some unknown other party insurance or something else, right? So essentially, that's why these things came into being, right? So how do these letters of credit operate? Like, how do we know that a letter of credit is actually good or genuine or whatever? A letter of credit always goes from the buyer's bank to the seller's bank, right? So it goes from bank to bank. It doesn't go directly to someone, and then the seller's bank will notify the seller, hey, we have a letter of credit for you. You good to ship the goods, whenever you need to, and do what you need to do. So essentially, what happens is both banks on both sides have to play ball with this letter of credit. And what are the rules of the game? Who determines what's right or wrong, if a bank on the other side is acting in good faith or not? Well, there's UCC rules, that have been developed by the International Chamber of Commerce, which all banks subscribe to. These are not law, but in all these disputes and cases, and there's a lot of case history out there where the court will apply this framework developed by the ICC in making a decision on who's right or who's wrong. So there's over the last 250 years, whatever, when the letters of credit have been disputed, these rules have been established and come into play, and they're very detailed and granular, and they include a wide variety of, what happens if this, what happens if that, and who's right and who's wrong. And so all these, they've been very, very well tested, and it's a very mature body of legal code, which, everybody's comfortable with, and all banks that work in letters of credit sign off on, right, and agree to behave in accordance with that. Some key terms of the letter of credit: the seller is typically the beneficiary. So if you hear the term beneficiary being thrown around, that's the, who's getting the benefit of the letter of credit, who's getting the payment out of that letter of credit. So the seller is typically the beneficiary of the letter of credit. Then letters of credit are generally irrevocable, meaning once a bank issues it, it can't be canceled without the consent of the beneficiary, without the seller's consent. So let's think about it. So you have a buyer, their bank issues a letter of credit, and you do all this work to get the shipment ready to go. And what happens if the letter of credit gets canceled and your goods are on the water, or you've shipped the goods already. So that's a big danger. So what happens is these are typically, the first thing you look for is an irrevocable, meaning it can be canceled without the seller consenting to it in writing. So that kind of protects you from those kind of scenarios. Furthermore, there's things that that your bank can do with the letter of credit to kind of replace that buyer's bank risk and buyer's country risk and the buyer's risk by confirming or discounting the letter of credit. We'll take a look at that in the following slides a little bit more. So why do businesses use these letters of credit, right? Why? So one, it guarantees you that you'll get paid as long as you ship the goods and present the documents that the letter of credit asks for. Typically, you ship the goods, you have your invoice for the buyer, you have your transport document, bill of lading, which is also the title document, and you may have a packing list or something else. Or you might have an FDA certificate if you're in the food business, right? So all these things will be listed out in the letter of credit, and it'll spell out clearly, once you submit these documents, we'll check those against the letter of credit, and if they're matching, we'll wire you the money. So you're guaranteed that you're going to get paid. Second, that we talked about the irrevocable nature of the LCs. They can't be canceled. They can't leave you high and dry if you're doing all this work to put the shipment together, hoping that the transaction goes through, and then they ditch you because they don't need the goods anymore. The prices are not as great as they were when they first spoke to you in their local market. So now they're looking to back out of the transaction. So those things you can avoid using letters of credit, which are really real risks, especially if you're dealing with a lot of food commodity stuff, and grains and so forth. Product disputes is a question that comes up all the time, where someone will say, well, what if I ship and they say, well, this is not the quality that I wanted, or something like that. It letters of credit are just financial instruments. Like, think of it, what are other financial instruments like bank checks, wires, ACHs, right? That most people are familiar with on their personal level, and these are more established here in the U.S. This is just another financial instrument like that, right? It does not care about what the what the goods disputed are, right? Dispute is about, right? As long as you shipped and presented documents that the letter of credit listed, you will get paid, right? Any dispute or anything like that is usually handled outside of the letter of credit process, right? The letter of credit can't be stopped. The check can't be canceled. It's established, it's processed, and as long as the documents are presented, it's good to go and it's paid, right? If there's a dispute, usually buyers and sellers will come together separately and figure out, okay, I'll rebate you this, or I'll send you something different next time, next order, or something like that. That's typically what we see.
Syed,
Yes, go ahead.
we have a question.
Oh, wonderful. Happy
So
to take those.
thank you. This person is wondering, what about services? What documentation proof is required when you are offering services as
Okay.
opposed to goods?
Yeah, great question. So letter of credits deal with physical goods, right? There are other things in the service business. You can do a standby letter of credit, which is not a documentary letter of credit, right? Which is a standby letter of credit, and it acts like a guarantee of payment if certain service benchmarks are met. That may be outlined in a service contract that you have executed. So what happens is, these are documentary letters of credit. I used that term specifically in the previous slides because they deal with shipment of actual physical goods, right? There has to be something. But in a service transaction, you may be able to deploy a standby letter of credit as a solution to kind of protect you against non-payment. Happy to address that separately, but they work, there are different rules governing them. Same body, ICC and National Chamber of Commerce has different rules for those because it's a slightly different solution, because it's not dealing with actual documents being presented or physical shipment. It's dealing with a what if scenario. It's standing by in case if something goes wrong. So, you have service contract says if you hit this benchmark, you can generate an invoice and the customer will pay you. And the customer doesn't pay you. Well, then in the standby letter of credit, it'll say, present that unpaid invoice, present a letter requesting the payment or a draft, and you'll get paid. That's the simplest language that you can build in there. It can get more complicated depending on what's your service contract and what legalese you want to put in there, but typically it's another instrument that's used in those scenarios. Hope that answers what they're looking
Yes.
for.
Yes, this person said thank you.
Okay.
All right, we're good to carry on now.
Thank you. So we're also, one of the major benefits that some of the more established businesses, regardless of again what life cycle they're in, use letters of credit is to deal with the financing terms that are prevalent in the market. Let's say you want to start shipping to a certain country and your exporters are offering 60-day terms to the buyer, saying, what does that mean? Saying, hey, I'll ship it to you with a letter of credit or without it, depending on what the relationship's like, but typically with the letter of credit, but you can pay me in 60 days after I ship. Whereas you may not be able to afford that kind of delay because you want to get paid on that because you got suppliers to pay or workers to pay, and then you want to move on to the next transaction as quickly as possible so you can build up your business and do more volume. So what that does is it kind of, it brings you to an impasse. You have a customer who's interested in your goods, the right price, whatever, the quantity is perfect, you can supply that comfortably, but they're asking for certain terms because the competitors are offering that. So how do you break into that market? So that's where letters of credit are used to agree to that 60-day term, but what they do is they use their banks to get paid earlier for early payment and not have to wait the 60 days. And I'll cover that in detail in the following slides, but I just wanted to put that up there, that it's also a financing tool. And we'll talk a little bit more about it in the next few minutes. One important thing, on payments under a letter of credit is reserved as opposed to open account payments. That's the last point on there. What does that mean? So what that means is that when there's a letter of credit that's comes in from your customer's bank, right, to your bank, and your bank advises you, here's the letter of credit that came, and you're good to go, and you start producing and shipping the goods that you have to do from your end, you can rely that payment for that letter of credit has been set aside by that issuing bank, by the customer's bank, to kind of make sure that they can pay that when that letter of credit payment comes due. Meaning, once you've shipped the goods and you presented the documents that the letter of credit calls for, you're allocated those dollars, so they'll wire it over and pay those. A very important example of this was, in the late 90s and early 2000s, the whole country of Argentina defaulted on their sovereign debt, on their bonds and everything else. They went through some economic turmoil, and it happens in different countries from time to time, based on what's going on in the local political situation or local laws, or whatever the economic situation may be impacted by. So they paid all the letter credits that were outstanding at the time of default in a timely manner. Whereas if you'd been selling to the customers there on open account basis instead of letters of credit, you were stuck. Either the customer didn't have access to dollars or the country didn't allow dollars to flow out of it. So there was those type of issues do pop up. You see that cycle from time to time as you look at these different markets that you're looking to expand into. So I'm previewed this a couple of times already. You talked about, how do businesses use letters of credit as a financing tool? How does that help me? Well, the way it works is, once your bank receives the letter of credit and they tell you, okay, we've received the letter of credit, and you want to de-risk that further, right? You want to, not worry about if the customer or the customer's bank or that country has any issues going on or whatever. You can remove all of that you can de-risk it by having your bank confirm that letter of credit. What does that mean? It doesn't mean confirming something in the general sense. What it means is that your bank, once they confirm, once they add their confirmation to that letter of credit, and they become what in the business is called a confirming bank. A confirming bank takes on that responsibility to pay you as long as you present those documents, ship the goods and present those documents that the letter of credit called for. So what it allows the seller or the exporter to do is really de-risk any of that transaction. And now their local bank that they deal with is the confirming bank and will pay them. And usually the local bank or confirming bank will pay them a lot faster than the buyer's bank in another country somewhere, right? Because it takes a few days for the documents to be shipped and for them to review and then allocate the dollars and wire it over, and then your bank to apply the wire to your account. So usually the confirming bank will pay you at least 3 weeks quicker, right? That may not sound a lot, but if you're looking to move on to the next order or next shipment, that in itself is worth, it accelerates your payment by 3 weeks for every order. And now you've got you're getting this financing, basically getting payment early, rather than having to wait, right? Even on a letter of credit which has no terms, so you get a lot. It becomes a financing tool. It provides you the cash early, and you can move on to the next payment. And the main benefit, obviously, like I mentioned, de-risks the transaction. You're dealing with your local bank who you know and trust. So why do companies do that? They will either do that because they are, they all of a sudden they've been used to doing, let's say, $100,000 order and maximum, and then all of a sudden they got a big order for 500,000 or something like that, and they're like, it's a big order, it's a little risky. Let's get our LC confirmed so that we can deal with that at some point. So we can absorb that and get paid quicker, and we know that our local bank will pay us and move on. Other more established companies, what we see in the life cycle, their risk departments or risk management protocols will say, okay, anything above this dollar amount, we got to automatically request confirmation, or anything this dollar amount, this country, or this bank, from this bank because it's slow paid us for some time, or this buyer because sometimes they're decent, but sometimes they'll play games and they'll delay payment. We're just gonna get confirmation on the letter of credit. So those are some of the ways that the companies will use this and kind of play around with it. Now, we talked about those payment terms, where you're breaking into a new market. You have a buyer, they like your goods, they like the price and everything else, but what they want is, hey, your competitor's offering me payment 60 days after you ship. Can you do something? And then that becomes, okay, well, how do I do this? I can't afford to do it. I need to get paid as soon as I can, because I got, staff, and I got, suppliers, and I got I fund my next order. So what they do is they will agree to a letter of credit with 60-day terms after shipment, meaning you pay, they'll see you ship, you present documents, everything's good, but you'll get paid 60 days after the shipment date, because that's what you agreed to. You can still get your bank to early pay you, and discount that 60-day period and pay you on, let's say, day 5, day 10 after you shipped. So what that does is it allows you to, again, become, use this. This is called discounting, not confirmation. This is discounting, because what happens is once you ship, you present the documents, your bank checks it, it goes to the buyer's bank. The buyer's bank checks it and says, the documents match, we'll pay you in 60 days, like the LC says. And what your bank will do at that point, once that buyer's bank has sent that message, they will discount that 60-day period and pay you sooner, and then collect from the buyer's bank on day 60. So that's kind of a financing tool that's really, if you are a startup business, if you don't have the creditworthiness, or if you're full up on your credit limit and stuff like that, and you're looking for additional ways to finance that next order and that transaction, this is a good tool, because the reason your bank is going to discount that 60-day term is because they're looking at the issuing bank and country and making that decision, rather than looking at your financials and looking at how much work you've done, or anything like that. So it's access to additional credit outside of what you may or may not qualify for today. Here's a transaction, a typical transaction. We have a contract between the seller and the buyer, right? They sign the contract. Then the seller ships the goods. And what's happened in the meantime is the buyer's bank, the issuing bank, has sent a letter of credit, which has been advised. After shipment, the seller presents a document to their bank. Their bank sends the documents onto the issuing bank, as I mentioned on the previous slide, and the issuing bank will then send the payment over and release the document to the buyer so they can pick up the goods that when the vessel arrives at the port. So essentially, it's a very basic transaction: contract, LC, goods shipped, documents sent in that the LC calls for. The issuing bank will send the payment for the documents, and the issuing bank takes the document and releases the documents to the buyer and debits the buyer's account for the payment that they had sent out. Essentially, that's the typical flow of the letter of credit transaction. Now, the letter of credit may be, you'll see the word cite or time here. The letter of credit may be pay immediately, which is called cite of documents. So it's cite LC, or it might be a time LC, meaning it says you get paid a few days after shipment. 30, 60, 90 is the typical time period that we see. Here's a case study for how to use this as a financing tool. We have a trading company for grains. They're considering $1 million, sale to a buyer in another country, and the buyer's cost over there in another country is usually typically higher, right, for their loan, because if they have to pay the seller upfront, they're going to borrow from their line of credit or pull from their account, which is also similar cost, opportunity cost to them. So their loan rate is 8 to 12% over there, whereas they can issue an LC for much cheaper, right? So automatically, by the seller agreeing to use a letter of credit helps them a lot. On top of that, from a cost perspective, helps the buyer a lot. On top of that, you agree to, like, if we have to discount that period, let's say the LC has a term attached to it, 90 days, that you'll get paid 90 days after shipment. If you discount that, it's much cheaper than what their loan is gonna they pay the loan in that foreign country onto their bank, right? So typically what we see clients do is say, we'll agree to a 90-day term LC, but you have to pay for our discounting cost to our bank, or we split the cost, or somewhere in between, right? What that means is the buyer A is saving, is ending up paying anywhere from, the discounting cost plus whatever the cost to issue the LC is. It's combined. If the buyer is taking both on, it's still cheaper than working capital costs that they're doing over there. And usually, when the buyer here, the region's client, agrees to accepting this type of an LC, they'll add a markup, right? Because they'll be saying, okay, well, we have to deal with our bank, and there's cost to do the paperwork and all that stuff. So they'll add some markup on there. And so if the buyer in the other country had to borrow from their local bank to pay for the site LC, they would have upfront costs, they would have some dollar to local currency conversion costs that's associated. Whereas if they were just issuing the LC and the bank here discounting them, and they're also paying the seller markup on top of that, they're still saving a lot of money. Okay, so the buyer here, the seller ends up making they're selling the goods, right? It's $1 million of grains or whatever, right? On top of that, they have this markup, which is essentially just the cost of them to accommodate this transaction, right? So they're making, on top of the profit they're making on the goods, the grains that they're selling, they're also making a little bit on the on the financing financial profit, right? They're adding on a markup. So there's two different types of profit that they're making on this transaction, right? One on the goods, on like the $1 million worth of grain that they're selling, is costing them maybe 990,000, right? Plus they're adding a little markup for the financing cost, and what that allows them to do is, add another revenue stream, add another profit stream to their transaction. It depends on what your relationship is with the buyer. Is it very common, very prevalent? Maybe, maybe not. So it depends on the country that you're dealing with and how sophisticated the buyer is and what they're interested in doing. Maybe they just want the grain and they don't care about any of the other stuff. They might be you may be dealing with a trading company somewhere overseas who just want to move the goods and they don't care about all of this stuff. So, but this is how, an example that we see how clients are successfully using this to not only make the profit on the grain that they're selling, but also make a little bit of a financial profit on top of that. So moving on to documented collections, which is if you recall, another solution that businesses use to bridge that payment risk gap between the buyer and the seller, right? What is, it is exactly the same as a letter of credit, except the bank is not issuing a letter, right? The documents that you had to submit for a letter of credit, meaning the invoice and the bill of lading and a packing a list or FDA certification, whatever the case might be, those documents are still being sent from your bank, the seller's bank, to the buyer's bank, but there's no letter of credit that's been issued by the buyer's bank calling for that. What happens is the seller's bank will send those documents along with a cover letter saying, this is a set of document, this is a collection notice for this shipment for your customer, the buyer, and the buyer's bank will receive it. It'll let the buyer know that, hey, these documents have come in. Do you want the originals? Because the original bill of lading is very key. It's a title document, right? It's like the title to your house or car that the buyer needs to go pick up the shipment when it arrives at port. So do you want this shipment, and do you want, are these the documents that you're waiting for? The buyer says, yes, thank you very much. I've been waiting on these, and please go ahead and debit my account and release the originals to me. So the buyer's bank is on the hook to only release the original title document once they have sent the payment to the seller's bank, right? So there is a certain level of control there. It's not a promise from that buyer's bank to pay you as a seller, but there is a control. You do maintain control over the shipment to a certain degree because the buyer's bank cannot hand over the original title document to the buyer for the goods unless they send you the payment, right? So the banks are still acting as proxies to a certain extent, as agents, but they're not on the hook to pay you. They are on but you can still use them to control that shipment and how it changes hands and when it changes hands, and you make sure that somebody pays you if the original title documents are released by the buyer's bank, right? So essentially what it does is, let's look at a typical transaction here. One, the seller or the supplier sends commercial and title documents and a draft to the bank. The bank then sends it over to the buyer's bank. The buyer's bank notifies the buyer, and the buyer authorizes the payment, saying, yes, I was waiting on these documents. Please debit my account and send the wire. The buyer's bank will then send the wire over to the seller's bank, and the seller's bank will settle it with the seller, will credit the seller's account with that fund. That means the seller's out and ready to go to the next transaction and move on. The buyer's bank may release the documents to the buyer directly or their customs broker or whatnot. So essentially what it does is it allows the seller to keep control over the shipment until they're paid, which is essentially an easier way to manage these transactions. Still not as risk averse as a letter of credit for the seller or the buyer, but it does allow a certain level of control over the shipment. So it is providing some protection. Comparatively, some features and benefits for the buyer and the seller, they do get some time because the documents take time to get over, whether it's 2 weeks or 3 weeks or longer. So it enhances their buyer's cash flow a little bit. They don't have to pay right away. They pay, when the documents get there and when they're ready to receive the shipment, right? They don't have to prepay the seller. From the seller side, from the exporter side, you're guaranteed that the buyer cannot pick up the shipment without paying you first, right? Which is the main thing that you're looking for. The title document to the shipment remains in banking channels, right? The banks have a responsibility not to release those, and they can recall that, and or you can reroute those documents to some other buyer if you need to. So there's some degree of control over those documents, right? Banks may give certain preferential financing treatment to these transactions. So when you are looking for financing or a line of credit with your bank, if you're doing these transactions this way, they may include that in your borrowing base, allow you to borrow against it and stuff like that. Otherwise, as compared to if you were doing it on an open account basis, where there's no checks or balances, you're just sending the title document to the buyer and hoping they'll pay you. At that point, the bank may say, this is a little risky. We're not going to lend against that. So these are some of the benefits that you see here. It's a little bit more streamlined, less paperwork involved compared to a letter of credit. So it is a little bit less cost-wise as well compared to a letter of credit. But there's between the two solutions, it is a little bit less less involved. Yes, sure, but the buyer's bank is not on the hook to pay you, right? You're still having to wait for the buyers to accept those documents and allow their bank to debit their account and pay you, and then wire the money. That's it. Happy to take any questions.
All right. Thank you. So I would love to invite all of our attendees to now put questions in the Q&A box. We're also monitoring chat, and we have some time with an expert here. So get those questions in there so we can ask Syed. All right. And Mercedes, was there anything that you wanted to add while we're giving people time to be able to type out their questions?
I wanted to encourage all the companies that are attending to contact the SBDC and let us know what is your interest, where are you trying to conduct, if exporting or importing, and then we can help you with counseling, with training. Also, we have very important initiatives in the food sector. We are also planning to have another one in advanced manufacturing and the cosmetic sector, for example. So I would really encourage all the participants to contact me directly or to contact the closest SBDC center that they have nearby.
Thank you.
There's
and I will drop some links here into the chat. And Mercedes, if you would like to drop your email there so that people can get in touch with you. And one thing that I do see a question, and we'll ask that in just a moment. One thing that I always like to ask our presenters is, in this process that you've been going over today, where do you see small businesses run into trouble? Where are those spots that, something that is a typical, might be a little bit of a roadblock or something that they struggle with, so that they can be aware beforehand?
I'm happy to take that one. So I feel that the number one roadblock is they don't get access to the right subject matter experts, right? So, where if you are, it's very easy to go down the street and open an account at the first bank that you see,
Mm.
and they'll handle all these basic services very efficiently and better than in most other banks that you talk to. But when it comes to these international specialized areas and stuff like that, either you're not big enough to get their attention, or you don't have the resources, you don't know who to reach out to. And that's where I think the SBDC program comes in very, very handy as a resource to kind of, even if something situation arises 6 months from now, you can easily reach out to the SBDC and they'll find someone to answer your question. That's what, that's so I think that the lack of accessibility to the right resources, to the right advice is the main challenge. Because often these things are not, anything that we cover today is not new, right? It's been around, but for over a century, but it's not very prevalent. Maybe you've not been exposed to it, and the access to that is not as simple as just walking down to your branch and asking a question. Because I would encourage somebody to have go through that experience, because we see that a lot, and they'll say, and they get the deer in the headlights look, and like, what else? Oh, we don't do that, some other department does that. Oh, can I talk to them? Yeah, we'll try to get you someone. And you never hear the rest of it. So, you know it's very important to have that access. That's the main roadblock that I see for businesses. The other thing is that we see a lot is cost wise, right? For especially if you're in the startup phase and you're not doing a lot of transactions, and you finally got the first few or first transaction, and now you look at the cost and it's like, I'm barely going to break even, so why am I bothering? So we see that, and there's I'd point to the slide that I covered about financing tool, right? There's ways to defer those costs and have the buyer pick up some of the costs and stuff like that. And that kind of market intel in terms of what is the true cost of my buyer to send me that a dollar payment from their country, right? Or versus what are they really paying their bank or when they borrow money, versus how can I use that information to leverage and share some of that cost burden. That's important as well. And it also matters when you have the right advice and right access. You can get, well, how can I make the what is going to I was dealing with a large company the other day, like maybe last month, I think. And this is a big entity that does a lot of transactions, and they were looking at their supplier files, and they were like, what we paid, how much of over the last 12 months from these letters of credit that we've been doing. And they were surprised at that, because they'd underestimated how much it would cost them. And so it's very, very common. You're not alone, right? So we see it in large corporations as well. But, so we had this whole discussion about how do we reduce the cost per transaction? Well, we talked about maybe using a site LC versus a 60-day LC and all this other stuff. So there's nuances to the LC itself that you can use and figure out, okay, I can live with this terms and conditions of the letter of credit because it's within my budget, right? Or so there's ways to figure that part out. So that's the two main things we see.
Thank you. And that is a perfect segue into this first question, because this first question was, as a small business owner, I pay so many fees for international payments. What are, can you review some of those best ways to lower those fees?
Yeah, so look at the transaction, right? If the customer is asking for a 90-day terms on the letter of credit, is going to cost more than a site LC, which is pay immediately at site of documents when the documents arrive, right? Because everything is based on tenor. It's a financing tool. Their bank's going to charge more, or your bank's going to charge more to process it, and all that stuff, right? That comes into it. Then, so there's that aspect, right? How do you tweak the transaction, the tenor of the transaction, or maybe if you're comfortable and your buyer is willing to pay you 20% upfront, you only have the letter of credit for that 80% of the transaction, which is a smaller dollar amount than the full 100%. So you save a little bit here, a little bit there, depending on the dollar amount, the tenor of the transaction, and the amount of paperwork. Because sometimes I see that's overcooked, right? You add, the letter of credit will have X, Y, Z. They'll copy and paste their whole sales contract into there. It doesn't need to be. Can be very simple, because what happens is if you overcook it and have all these terms and conditions, guess what? There's more work in reviewing that. Guess what? It increases your chances of having discrepancies or mistakes in the paperwork that you submit to get payment under that LC. and it's going to delay for you because now you got to fix those payments, and then it's going to cause you to have these fees associated with that transaction as well, because the bank's going to charge you for these discrepancies that you have. So simplify, look at how if you can break up the transaction, the 20%, 80%, and also look at the term of the LC, like it can shorten it. Can you live with that, or can the buyer take some of that? So those are the 3 ways I'd say on that, on a specific transaction, that you can do.
Thank you. Okay, our next question. What is your advice for small businesses that are just starting to build relationships with international buyers regarding payment terms?
I would say find out what banks they use, if they're comfortable using letters of credit, right? If they're comfortable, uh, if they're a buyer, then if they're comfortable giving you some down payment up front, right? And because that 20, for that example that I said, was 20% upfront deposit, it's very common, right? And what it does is that 20% allows you to cover a lot of what your cost is going to be associated, or your startup cost for that shipment, for that order is going to be. So it allows you to keep the lights on and move on and to the next stage and keep the transaction going. And if going, and there was the question talked specifically about just building relationships. One of the ways you can do is find out what their financing costs are at their end, right? Why? Because and this is pertaining to the first question as well, how do you reduce costs? Because if you don't know that, you don't know what you're negotiating against, because that buyer from their seat, they're thinking about, if I have to pay him sooner rather than or if I can wait 60 days, 30 days to pay them, then it'll cost me 1 or 2 months less interest, and my interest cost is at 10% on my line of credit with my local bank in my local country. So if you as a seller know that, now you know where they're coming from, what you have to work with, and how you can position your argument or your request on that transaction accordingly. So that's very important to know. Is just don't just focus in on, most people focus in on the goods, quality, quantity, this, that, the other, why they should buy from them, and they'll focus in on the price, right? There's more to it than the price of the goods itself, right? You got to be a little bit more expansive in the relationship and figure out what other factors may influence the buyer's decision.
And
Yes,
if you
please,
don't mind,
Mercedes.
yes, I was going to add about export credit insurance, that sometimes, it depends on the amount that we are talking about in the contract. And if it's not a very substantial amount, then maybe the cost of the letter of credit will not be justified. But the seller has the ability to obtain export credit insurance from private sources or from the Exim Bank as well. So,
Yes.
and also how people bear risk, depending on how comfortable they feel. And if it's a new client, I will investigate the company that is buying. And there are certain tools that you can use through the Department of Commerce, for example. You can have a company profile and find out about their credit ratings, and have better understanding of who is buying from you, especially at the beginning, until you have developed the trust. So that's outside from the banking realm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, our next question, we're going to talk a little bit about duties and customs. Is there a good resource to refer to that helps determine what discounts you should give your buyer because of duties and customs?
Look, duties and customs are set. They're set by the government, and they can change at any time, but you have to find that out. It's usually a public information, in that country, or in that market, right? So that's, I'm not sure if they're asking about the duty. So they're saying, is there a way to find out what duties and customs their buyer is going to end up paying when they
Well,
bring it?
determining discounts that they might
Yeah,
give based
Yeah,
on those.
this is
yeah,
the realm of this presentation is about method of payments.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yes, and I will be happy to entertain the
Yeah.
question after this webinar. So if this person will email me, I will be happy.
Perfect.
The short answer is you can have that information, knowing the harmonized tariff code schedule, you can find what are
Yeah.
the tariffs and what are the costs, because that will be your freight forwarder that could provide you with that. But again, this is not about methods of payment. So I'm sorry, just email me and I will
All
address
right.
it later. Thank you.
Sounds good. Okay. And so remember that Mercedes's email address is in the chat. So we would love to have you get in touch with her to get some further details on that specific question. Okay. Our next question, and I think our last one for the day.
Same thing.
Okay. Yes. So this person wanted to know about lawyers and legal resources relevant to exports and imports.
I will say this, that if you're looking to figure out what, you know, anything to do with the terms and conditions in the letter of credit, you don't have to go to a lawyer. Just have your buyer just send you a draft of the letter of credit, that payment that they're thinking about for that contract, and you can sit down with your bank or reach out to whoever your resources, and review it with them. So that's, you don't need to actually excuse, excuse me, incur that lawyer fee for that review. Thank you.
Thank you. And we did have one more question come in at the last moment here. So he said, I think you already answered this, but if you could recap, clarify. So how can businesses effectively leverage documentary collections to reduce disputes or payment delays?
Documentary collections. Look, documentary it's in the word. Letters of credit and documentary collections, they deal with documents, right? So if there's a dispute on the goods that you shipped over, or that were sent, that's handled outside of both those instruments, right? Regarding, because the documentary letter of credit, documentary collections deal with documents, meaning if you submit those documents, you're requesting payment against those documents. That's it, right? If it's a letter of credit, the bank will the issuing bank that issued the letter of credit is on the hook to pay you. And if it's a collection, you know, the buyer's bank is not on the hook to pay you, but they
Exactly.
will but they will pay you if they hand over the original to the buyer to collect the shipment, right? Then they have to pay you. So that's what they deal with in terms of dispute. Now, what there was a second part to this question, I believe.
So how
eh,
can businesses effectively leverage documentary collections to reduce disputes or payment delays?
Payment delays. Now, payment delays on a letter of credit, it, there's a there's a there's a specific date that the payment date on there, right? Whether 60 days after shipment date, or immediately at site of documents, so you get paid depending on within a certain range of dates. You know exactly when you're going to get paid, or if it's a site LC, meaning at site of documents, a range that you'll get paid in the next 15 to 10 days, whatever the case may be. But on documentary collections, all the buyer's bank is on the hook to do is let the buyer know, we have these documents. Do you accept that? And do you allow us to credit the payment? So the buyer keeps control of when they pay you. So they can, if they choose to, they can, if they're a bad actor or if they're tight on cash, they may say, hey, not yet. I'm going to wait till I can see the vessel from from the U.S. or at the port here, and then do it, right? So that can happen, right? So those things can leave you hanging out there. But on the other hand, you do maintain control of the title document to the shipment, right? If you needed to find another buyer and have the documents routed to another buyer who's ready to pay you for those same goods, then you can still do that, right? So you do not give up control of the shipment. So that's a way to counteract that payment delay a little bit. But a letter of credit is very, something's gone wrong, like Russia's invaded Ukraine or something like that, to have a payment delay on a letter of credit. But on a documentary collection, um, typically, you can't avoid that because the bank's not on the hook, right, to pay you. But you can control the shipment and route it to some other buyer who's ready to pay you, and use that as a tool.
Yes, like they will not be able to take possession of the goods unless
Pay.
you have something to play there. It's like if you don't pay me, I am not giving you the bill of lading. You're not going to be able to pick up the goods there. And what I was going to add to that is that, of course, there are more fees attached, but there are different types of letter of credit, as I just said. So you can have a confirmed letter of credit, which added security to that payment. But to get that added security is going to cost more. So it all comes to risk and how much you are willing. I think it depends on the amount always. What is worth doing depending on the amount that you are trying to collect, etc. But if any of the attendees want a further discussion and further information, we have tons of tools, resources. We have our research department as well, and there is quite a bit of information if they need to understand this concept of risk and the concept of fees, what I'm having to pay for securing more and more and more my transaction. I think those are the key points here.
Thank you both. And so we are at time, so we will wrap up for today. But I want to say a huge thank you to Syed. So much fantastic information for our attendees today. And of course, to our own Dr. Mercedes Sanchez-Moore. We always love having you on these webinars and sharing your expertise. To our attendees, thank you so much for your questions today, and we appreciate you being with us. We hope that if you have a few moments, you will answer our survey that will display as we shut the webinar down. We'd love to hear from you, how you thought things went today, and what else you need information on and that we can help provide education for. Mercedes, was there anything that you wanted to say here in closing?
I really am very thankful to Syed for providing the presentation and coming along and becoming a partner. And I just want to announce that we have another webinar coming up very soon. It's the Global Market Research. So I hope that the attendees have seen this, but you have my email right there. You can email me. We can always contact you. We always do webinars every month. And like I said, we have one-on-one consulting. If there are any questions or any further matters that you would like to discuss with Syed, that contact me, and then I will forward the question for him and get in touch to specifically form that very important relation with your banker. It's super important that you have a person that you can identify and that you can make questions, also be able to discuss financing options, etc. Okay.
Thank you. And I just dropped the link for that webinar. It is next Tuesday, February 4th, 2:30 to 4 p.m. So if you want to click on that link quickly here before we shut down, it's in the chat right now for you. And the topic for that webinar will be global market research, as Mercedes said, and we will have a presenter from the U.S. Commercial Service and an international trade resources librarian with the New York Public Library. So it should be a fantastic session. All right, everyone, have a fantastic rest of your day. And again, thank you for being with us. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for your fantastic job as always. And
My pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, all.